Well, we're continuing the period of the kingdom with the northern kingdom. We finished our last session recognizing that Solomon worshipped idols and that the kingdom was going to be torn away from him. So that's what we've read. And this story now is picked up with his son Rehoboam, who becomes king in his place. So as we're starting to look at the northern kingdom, I want to just alert you to a couple of things on the timeline. If you have the timeline in front of you, I'd encourage you to get it out. So first of all, we'd already mentioned that the crown is red. The red crown means that every king in the northern kingdom is not from the tribe of Judah. So they're what we call illegitimate kings, something like that. This is a rival kingdom and it's not going to last. So that's the first thing to recognize. The second thing to recognize is that you will find a key on the timeline that has it is on the back of the timeline, and it is also a little picture is given under each king in the northern kingdom, and you're either going to find one sword, two swords, or a people picture. And I just want to alert you to that. Look at the back of the timeline. It's in the study guide as well. It's going to remind you and help you to understand what takes place, because the people picture indicates that the king is a son of the preceding king. A sword indicates a king has killed the preceding king. Two swords mean a king has killed the preceding king and another household. So it's pretty turbulent time in the northern kingdom, because this is not dynastic succession, even though there are a couple of places where we see that. This is, you want to become king, someone else then assassinates you, and then you become king. And God is also bringing judgment against particular kings in the northern kingdom. The other thing to keep in mind as you look at the northern kingdom is that the dates are 930 BC, which is the date for the division of the kingdom. That's important to recognize, 930. And the kingdom concludes in 722 BC, 722. So what this means is we are now going to have a northern kingdom in Israel with the capital in Samaria, and we have a southern kingdom in Jerusalem with Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. So northern kingdom and southern kingdom. The books for this period are going to be Kings and Chronicles, but sometimes you're going to struggle with working out who the king is. That's why you want to keep the timeline in front of you, because it's going to highlight who the king is, and you'll be able to see the king. And you'll also see on the timeline that I've given you a brief summary of each king, at least the important ones, not every king, but the important ones, to help you to understand and get the historical context for the northern kingdom. When we think about the prophets, you also want to be aware of, we have our 8th century prophets, Hosea, Amos, and Jonah. In other words, God's calling these prophets, especially Hosea and Amos, to proclaim God's word to the northern kingdom. And there are also the earlier prophets, Elijah and Elisha, and some other figures turn up, but these are the main ones. So really 5 main prophets in the north, although the ones that have their own books, Hosea, Amos, and Jonah. So remember, no dynastic succession. The other thing is, keep in mind the maps. If you have the maps in front of you, the map for the united monarchy showed the kingdom as it was expanding under David and then Solomon. But now you'll find the map for the divided kingdom shows that Israel, gives you a picture geographically where Israel is in the north and where Judah is in the south. So you may want to have that open just to, again, it helps you to see the picture and to learn the storyline. So as we look at the northern kingdom, I'm not going to focus on every king, but I'm simply going to highlight 2 kings, Jeroboam and Ahab. Because if you know a little bit about these 2 kings, it's going to help you get the flavor of the kingdom as a whole. So I'm going to highlight a couple of things with Jeroboam and Ahab, and then we'll look at the prophets Hosea and Amos just briefly, and the end of the kingdom. So that's where we're headed. So first of all, 1 Kings chapter 11, and I'm focusing now in Kings rather than in Chronicles, because Chronicles tends to focus more on the southern kingdom. We want to look at the northern kingdom, so we're going to stay in Kings. So that's where we're headed. So first of all, in 1 Kings chapter 11, we saw this is the place where Solomon turns and worships other gods. In the same chapter, there is a prophetic message in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 29 following, and what you find is the prophet Ahijah is going to go to Jeroboam, this man named Jeroboam, who's a military leader. He's going to go to him and said, God's appointed you to be king over the northern kingdom because this judgment is coming. And he has a garment and he tears it in 12 pieces and he gives 10 pieces to Jeroboam, and he said, God's going to give you 10 tribes in the north. So that's the background of it. Then if you look at 1 Kings chapter 12, so now that's the prophetic background. We've got judgment coming, we've got the prophet. And now if you look at 1 Kings chapter 12, we have Solomon's son Rehoboam, who is you'll see him for the southern kingdom. He becomes king. Now what happens at this point is that there is conflict with the tribes, with the house of David, and the people really are fed up. There's been huge labor force required for the building of the temple, and basically they say to Rehoboam, look, we want you to lighten up our load. Rehoboam listens. Instead of listening to the elders, he listens to his young buddies, and they say to him, look, you're the king, basically do whatever you want to do. And so he, in fact, doesn't listen to the people, and the people say, kind of, we're done with you, David, O house of David. So they head up north with Jeroboam as their leader. So that's what takes place. But I want to highlight now, what does Jeroboam do when he becomes king? And this is recorded in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25 following in those verses. Okay? So, and this is really, if there's one king that you want to learn about in the northern kingdom to understand that what is this spiritual climate, Jeroboam's our guy, and then if there's two, then it's Ahab as well. So what does he do? He sets up the kingdom in the north, and he is concerned that maybe people are going to go and sacrifice down in Jerusalem. And what about the festivals? They're going to go and sacrifice in the south. And so he sets up 2 sites in Dan and Bethel. And you want to look at those on the map to see where they are. Dan is way up in the north. He sets up 2 sites at Dan and Bethel, and he builds golden calves. And he sets them up at these 2 places. And this is what he says in verse 28 of 1 Kings chapter 12. He says, behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. Remember that from Exodus chapter 32 to 34, the golden calf story? Now he's doing the same thing. And I want you to notice the 2 golden calves on the timeline in the northern kingdom. They look just like the one that they made when they're in Egypt. And so now we're seeing the heart of God's people, and they're bent toward idolatry, right? They're getting their categories of God from the culture around them. They're doing what the nations do in terms of their worship of who God is and their identity of who God is. And so you'll see on the timeline 2 golden calves. And I have this summary for Jeroboam. Builds altars at Dan and Bethel. Non-Levites as priests, because the Levites are going to head south. He makes 2 idols, Israel's gods, and notice the last bullet point, idols remain over the next 200 years. That's what's important to remember. If you don't remember anything else from this, remember Jeroboam sets up 2 idols, and those 2 golden calves at Dan and Bethel, they remain for the next 200 years. And you have to ask the question, why does God allow idolatry to continue for 200 years? And I want to suggest to you that he is going to bring judgment against individual kings. He's going to send his prophets, but this is ultimately because of his grace and mercy. He is slow to anger, and he's going to send prophets to try and bring people back to the Lord. And so his judgment is going to finally come in 722 BC. So now I want to look at our next king. We're now thinking about Ahab. So I'm really skipping ahead, and you'll see this on the timeline. I'm jumping ahead several chapters, and now I want to pick up the story of Ahab, and you'll see on the timeline I have the following bullet points: wife Jezebel, Baal worship, idolatry, worst northern king, Elijah at Mount Carmel, the Lord is God. So that's the quick summary. And let me just read a couple of verses about Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 for a couple of verses. Verse 29, now Ahab, the son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa's reign. Verse 30, Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Verse 31, it came about as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, that he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal. Notice what's in the name there. Man of Baal, Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went to serve Baal and worshipped him. So now we have another god that's being brought into this worship. We call it syncretism. So we have the idols at Dan and Bethel, and now we have Baal worship. Baal is the Canaanite god, the storm god, and he's going to worship Baal. And verse 32, it says he built an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built at Samaria. So we have, think of it now, another city. You can see this on the timeline. And then also verse 33, he also made the Asherah, which is another female deity. So you are having rampant idolatry in the northern kingdom. So God is going to raise up, look what comes next in 1 Kings chapter 17. God raises up Elijah the prophet. He is going to, on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18, he is going to be the prophet who says to God's people, who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve Baal, or are you going to serve the Lord God? And so there's what we call like this sort of contest or something between the gods, and God reveals himself in that story to be the Lord God. So that's very, very important. And you find out that Elijah says, I'm the only prophet around because there are 400 prophets of Baal. So you start to see the climate of the kingdom. And you're also starting to see what's something about the human heart that likes to worship idols, gods that they themselves have made, because they are in control, because they can tell a God what to do, but the God is not going to define to them how they are to live. And we've seen that was already hinted at in Genesis chapter 3 with the story of the fall, and we saw it in the golden calf narrative in Exodus 32 to 34. And don't miss the fact that now the sin and the heart of God's people is bent on worshiping things other than God. And so Paul in Romans chapter 1 is going to bring together the Adam story and the golden calf story. And what he's really trying to saying is that the Israel story is giving us an understanding of the human story, which has already started in Genesis chapter 3. So this is the human story that's being displayed in the history of Israel. The days are going to be coming when God is going to do a new work in his people, because Ezekiel's going to say, you don't need just somehow renewal of the law, you need a new heart. And he's going to say that idols are lodged in the human heart. And so he's actually going to say, you need a new heart. You need heart surgery. That's what you need. Heart surgery, not simply another commitment to obey the law. You need heart surgery. And God is going to promise to give a new heart to his people. He's going to take out that heart of stone and give them a new heart. So that's what's ahead in terms of the promises. But right now in the story, we're still in the midst of it, and we get to see what the human story looks like. And this is a great example of it. We have the story in 1 Kings chapter 21, where Ahab is also going to covet someone else's vineyard. Jezebel gets involved. She orchestrates the death of Naboth. God's going to bring judgment against the house of Ahab, and he's going to ultimately die in a battle against the Arameans. A pretty hideous kind of again story. And then dogs are going to lick up his blood in the pool of Samaria. And then King Jehu is going to bring judgment against his 70 sons, and he's going to bring judgment against his 70 sons, and then judgment also against Jezebel, who's going to be, it's pretty amazing what happens with her as well. So I'll let you read about that. As we start to move toward the end of the kingdom, I'm just going to mention briefly Hosea and Amos, and then the end of the kingdom in 2 Kings 17. So during this time, God also raises up the prophet Hosea. He is calling God's people back to loyalty to God, and he's going to say, you're like playing the harlot after these other gods. And he's going to marry a woman who becomes unfaithful, and therefore he's calling people to return to the Lord in this context of idolatry. God also raises up the 8th century prophet Amos, and he is going to say, you know what, not only are you worshipping idols, but you have also not followed God's laws and his righteousness and his justice. And so he picks up some of the social issues that are taking place that have come as a result of their heart turning away from the Lord. And he picks up social issues like justice and righteousness. And so that's also important, because that was part of the law of God. And then finally, the kingdom comes to an end in 722 BC, and the passage in 2 Kings chapter 17 describes why it comes to an end. And God is going to say that they continued to worship the gods of the nations, and they built high places, and they worshipped Asherah. And he says, I sent my prophets, verse 13, I warned Israel through my prophets. And I said, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, but they did not listen. And so God is going to bring judgment against the northern kingdom. The Assyrians are going to come against the north. They'll defeat Samaria. And then there's what we call population shifting. People are sent into exile, and others, foreigners, are brought into the northern kingdom. So if you want to read about what happens at the end, 2 Kings chapter 17 gives the end of the northern kingdom. And so now we're going to continue we're going to go backtrack a few years to go back to the southern kingdom to see what happens next.